I'm Anne and welcome back to my channel. If you've noticed that the camera is a little bit different and also the audio quality is either worse or better, I'm not sure. That's just because I'm using my phone to film this instead of using my camera and my microphone, and we'll see if it's better or worse. I'm not sure how it's going to be or how I'm going to like it. I wanted to see because this is a lot easier to film like this, and I've been noticing that the quality of my camera picture is just not that great in the low lighting that is my room. So I'm curious if my quality on my phone is going to be worse or better. So this is more of an experiment. So let me know what you think. Also, Merry Christmas! Today is Christmas, and for those who celebrate Christmas, I hope you have an amazing day today, though I'm sure very few people will actually be watching this on like Christmas Day. I mean, who watches like BookTube on Christmas Day? I will probably be, but you know, I am a whole other bag of kettle of worms. So it's the end of year, which means I wanted to just look back on my reading for the previous year. I already did the end of year book tag. I already looked at my reading resolutions, but now I wanted to take a general view of like how my reading went in 2021, and also like some of my favorites, and then also a look on Goodreads and Storygraph for stats. Usually I just pick out like an amount of books and say like 5 of my top favorite of the year, but this year I want to do it differently, and I want to say like, what is my favorite horror of the year? What is my favorite nonfiction of the year? And things like that, and kind of like break it down into that. And these are not necessarily books published during this year, but more of just books that I read this year. So we're going to do my 7 favorites of the year, and then I think it's 8 favorites of the year, and then my 6 least favorites, the books I disliked the most. And then we're going to get to some of my general stats, both on Goodreads and the Storygraph. So let's get started. My favorite nonfiction in general is As You Wish, Inconceivable Tales from the Making of the Princess Bride by Carrie Ells. So this movie was such a big part of my childhood, The Princess Bride. It came out in the 80s and I loved it. And I was really excited to see that they had like a nonfiction book. And even though it is technically written by Carrie, actually all the actors that were still alive during that time kind of shared their own stories. And especially the audiobook is just amazing. I got it from the library and it has all the original voices telling their stories. And it's just such a cool experience. So if you can get your hands on the audiobook, I recommend it actually more than the book, because even though the stories are great, to actually hear it in their voices, it's kind of like you're getting to know them as people, and it's such an incredible book, especially if you've enjoyed Princess Bride. And if you haven't seen Princess Bride, what are you doing with your life? Because it's an amazing movie. Next is kind of similar to the last one, and that is nonfiction history, my favorite one. And that goes to Unbroken by Laura Hildebrand. I talked about this a couple months ago when I read it, and I've gushed about this book enough, but basically it is about this Olympic runner who fought in World War II and ended up in a POW camp in Japan and had to endure horrific treatment by the Japanese. It's an amazing book, and I wish I had read it sooner, because I have owned a copy of that book for probably like 3 or 4 years, and I only now read it. So I wish I'd read it before, because it's an amazing book. I highly recommend it. Next one is my favorite mystery, and that one goes to Busman Honeymoon by Dorothy L. Sayers. Probably if I read either an Agatha Christie or Dorothy L. Sayers in the year, they will be my favorite like mystery, because even though I love modern cozy mysteries, they're just not as top tier as like Dorothy Sayers and Agatha Christie. So, all right, the next one is favorite classic. And this was a toss-up because I did read War and Peace this year, but I think when it comes to enjoyability, because I definitely struggled at certain points with War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy, so I decided to go instead with The Histories by Herodotus. I have been wanting to read this for years. It has been on my TBR, and I read it for my Greek historiography class this semester, and it was well worth reading. I absolutely loved it. It was a brilliant book. I just cannot gush about it enough. So yeah, it was my favorite classic of the year. Though I did just this month actually finish Bleak House. I actually finished it yesterday. And I really enjoyed that too. So like there's a lot of good, very long classics I read this year. Next one is favorite fantasy. And for that, again, like I read some really cool, good fantasy this year. Like I read the first Eye of the World by Robert Jordan, and I really enjoyed that. But I think I'm going to go with Empire of the Vampire by Jay Kristoff, just because the world was just so incredible. And even if I definitely had criticisms of the book, I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. It was just the world and how the plot built and how the adventure and how all the political climate and the survival climate, it was just so brilliant. Again, it's a long book. I've noticed a theme with my reading this year is all my favorite books were very long. I mean, not all of them, so. The next one is my favorite historical fiction, and I read my favorite recently, and that is Once Upon a Wardrobe by Patti Callahan. She also wrote Becoming Mrs. Lewis that I read last year, and actually earlier this year, I was looking back on my Goodreads, and I just read Becoming Mrs. Lewis in like April or something like that. This one was so good. It's a fiction, but it tells about it features C.S. Lewis and different nonfiction characters, and it's just such an inspiring, sweet, but also bittersweet book. And it does have like a semi-sad ending, but it's very adorable. And if you have enjoyed the Chronicles of Narnia, I highly recommend it. The next one is my favorite middle grade book, and that one, I'm too lazy to get my copy off my shelf, and that is The Doll Maker of Krakow by R.M. Romero. I read this earlier in the year, and it tells of this doll who comes to Poland in the 1930s as under Nazi occupation. So on one sense, it's like a fantasy middle grade book, but on the other sense, it's a historical fiction, and it is very bittersweet, very sad, but also incredibly adorable. And for a middle grade book, it really tackles deeper themes than I'm used to middle grade books doing. And that's what I love about middle grade books, because it's kind of this medium between kids' books where a lot of the ideas are underdeveloped and very simplistic, and there's nothing wrong with that. But then you have like YA and adult where it's much more mature. But when it comes to middle grade, it falls in this middle amount where things are still simplistic and yet can be incredibly deep. So that's why I love middle grade so much, and this was definitely the best book I read this year that was a middle grade book. All right, and finally, we have the favorite horror, and that is going to be The Troop by Nick Cutter. This was such an unpleasant book to read. I was traumatized by it, but it's also an incredible book. It's very gross at times. It's very traumatic at times. It tells of these Boy Scouts who get on this island and can't get home, and there's this like parasite, and it's disgusting, but it is a beautiful book. So, all right, now we get to my least favorites of the year. And I only have 6 for these, okay, which isn't even that bad. And the way I looked at this is not necessarily the lowest score I gave, but oftentimes the most disappointing read. Because if I went into it with very low expectations, I probably didn't mind that I really disliked it. But if it was a really hyped book, a book that I was really looking forward to reading, and it was very bad, then it was a little disappointing for me. So since we ended with my favorite horror, let's start with my least favorite horror. And that's going to be The Blood Countess by Lana Popovic. This tells of Elizabeth Bathory, who is a real historical character, even though she's like half myth, half reality. And she apparently in history would take servant girls and murder them and bathe in their blood. I don't know, the legends are all over the place when it comes to her, but this tried to take a look at one of her ladies in waitings and see her life, and it was really bad. I did a rant review for this, I think in November during my wrap up, so I just did not like it. Nope. All right, least favorite sequel, that is going to go to, and I feel bad about this, The Truth, the Divine by Lindsay Ellis. I love the first book of this series, and I was really disappointed because the first book was so good. And I know a lot of people in the sci-fi community, the sci-fi bookish community, I should say, have been critical about this first book, as well as I haven't heard as much about this book, but I love the first book, and I feel like the second book kind of ignored the main characters and just started following new characters, and I just could not care at all about them. So yeah, wasn't a big fan. All right, the next one is least favorite anticipated release. This is and I don't anticipate many releases. So when I do, it's usually by authors that I really enjoy. And this was by Kazuo Ishiguro. He wrote The Remains of the Day, and I love that book so much. But this one is Clara and the Sun. Here's the problem. I feel like Ishiguro was trying to say something deep with this book, but he never went all the way. So, like, there were interesting themes that were discussed, but none of them were finished or concluded. And I don't know, the book just kind of meandered and never actually went anywhere, even though there were important themes that were like hinted at and then ignored for the rest of the book. So I was disappointed with this. Next book is my least favorite fantasy. Again, this is going to be controversial, but that is Shadow and Bone by Leigh Bardugo. And one of the reasons I have this on my list, because there were some other fantasies that I was disappointed in this year. But because I have this on my list is because it's such an anticipated book, and my fiance really loves this series, and I just really did not like this first book. I have done a long review for each of these books, all three of the books, and I actually increased my liking for it over the series. So I believe the first book I gave 2 stars, the second book I gave 3 stars, and the third book I gave 4 stars, which says to you that the writing got better. And I think it's because this is Bardugo's first series, and she was really finding her voice as a writer and learning how not to fall into cliches and things like that, because her Six of Crows duology I really enjoyed. The first book I loved. So it's not as much her I think I dislike, it's just that she was such an unpolished writer in the first book that I really struggled to get through the Shadow and Bone first book. But after that, it did get better. Like, the second one I still had problems with, but I enjoyed it better, and the third one I really enjoyed for the most part. Then, least favorite thriller, and technically this is kind of like sci-fi too, and that's The 1000th Floor by Katharine McGee. This tells of a dystopian world where there are a thousand floors building where these people live in the future, and the higher you live, the more powerful you are, and the lower you live, the poorer you are. And it deals with a murder. I think definitely it feels much more like a thriller than a sci-fi, even though it has the setting that is really fascinating. The setting was amazing. But everything, all the characters, all the thrilling parts, all the romance parts absolutely sucked. So yes, did not like this book, was disappointed with it. All right, and finally, least favorite YA book. I gotta go with John Green because I read like 4 of his books this year and I did not like any of them that much. But his least favorite one that I read was Looking for Alaska. I did not like this book at all. It was horrible. It was all horrible. I disliked it. So those are my favorites of the year and least favorites of the year. I'm curious if you've read those and if you agree with me or disagree with me. Are there some in my favorites that you absolutely hated? Are there some in my least favorites that you absolutely loved? I'd love to hear your thoughts about them. And finally, we gotta look at some stats. I'm on my Goodreads right now. As you can see, I read 146 books this year. Now, there's still about a week left of the year, so I'm not going to say that it's out of the realm of possibility that I will read at least 2 to 3 books more. I have been reading rather slow this holiday season just because I have been so busy, but I can see myself reading at least 1 or 2 more. So yeah, definitely not up to 150 books though. I'm not going to read like 4 in 1 week. But I did read 50,000 pages, which is pretty impressive, might I add. The shortest book I read is the graphic novel Snow, Glass, and Apples by Neil Gaiman. This is a adaptation of the short story into a graphic novel, and I did not like this book. But the longest book I read is, of course, War and Peace. Nobody is surprised about that. Nobody is surprised about that. Average book length is 342 pages. Most popular book I read is The Fault in Our Stars by John Green. No surprise with that. And of course, the least popular one is The Making of Wisconsin. 3 people shelved. Least popular. No one is surprised about that. All right, my average rating of 2021 was 3.2 stars, which it makes sense. It's average. And I do feel like this year I gave fewer books 5 stars, but I also feel like I gave fewer books 1 stars. So I think that most of the stars I gave were in between 2 stars to 4 stars. So now let's go into Storygraph. And I haven't been really looking on Storygraph. Obviously, I had a goal of reading 105 books, both on Goodreads and on Storygraph, and I obviously beat that by 40 some books, which is great. Now I did notice that the pages are slightly different on Storygraph, and I think that's because when I transferred over, some of the books were cut, some were different editions with different page lengths. I have been looking actually at editions when I go in and put in new books in Storygraph, but if it transferred over wrong, I'm not going to go back and look at every book I have on Storygraph, okay? All right, so when it comes to books, so let's see the moods. Again, I am not surprised by this because number 1 is mystery. Number 2 is adventurous. Number 3 is dark. Number 4 is reflective. Number 5 is emotional. Mysterious and adventurous, especially, is fitting for me. I read a lot of mysteries, and I do love adventure. What I'm really surprised about is the pace. It is even for everything. So it is 35% slow, 32% fast, and 33% medium, which is equal for almost all of that. The next one is page number. And on average, 54% are between 300 and 499, which again, not surprising at all. I have been reading slightly longer books, but not that long. But again, I do read a lot of shorter books as well. So 37%. But the 500 plus books is more than I usually read. 9% of books I read this year are over 500 pages, which is not surprising because I did read a few 1,000-page books. So again, nonfiction, fiction, I'm not surprised about this. I do predominantly read fiction, even if I enjoy nonfiction and I have it on my TBR and I do try to read some books that are nonfiction. I just don't read it as much. Genres, again, no surprise here. Number 1 is historical. Yep. And number 2 is mystery and young adult, fantasy, classics, thriller, history, etc. All very things that I read all the time. So I'm not super, crazed about. Format is all wrong. This is not right because a lot of times I can't find the audiobook that I listen to, and a lot of these I do read on audiobook. So I don't put in if it's digital versus if it's audiobook versus it's print. I don't tend to worry about that. So most read authors of this year. Again, I don't read that many books per author, so this is no surprise. My number 1 is Sarah Rosette, who wrote the High Lady Detective Mystery series or whatever it's called. And I read 6 books in there, but they're very light, easy to get through, which is why I read so many of them. I also read the entire series of Dorothy Must Die by Danielle Page, which is why this is so high. So no surprise there. All right. Number of books and pages. So this is interesting graph because these are pages read versus books read. And you can see most of them are relatively consistent, which makes sense. the more books I read, the higher my page count is. You do see some discrepancy. For example, in October, I'm surprised that it is so low. Oh, it's probably because I read a bunch of like R.L. Stine books that are very short. And the next month, November, is extremely high. And again, that's no surprise because I finished War and Peace, I finished Herodotus, and those are like one book, but they're, whoo! They're one book, but they're very long. So yeah. And my average rating, interesting. Yeah, so I only started to look at the in-between stars since joining the Storygraph, because on Goodreads you can only do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 stars. It makes sense how my majority is still in that, because that's how my brain thinks. It's like, this is more 2-star, this is more 3-star. And I have been trying to like work on better with that, but it makes sense how, because I only started using Storygraph like over halfway through the year. So there are all the stats that I have on books that I read. I'm really happy with my reading this year. Next year is going to see a lot of changes. I have a lot of different goals to have. I will be wrapping up the books that I read in December. Next week for the 1st of January, 2022. Guys, this is the last time I will see you until 2022, which is crazy. End of year. I hope that 2022 brings joy and blessings to all your lives, and I hope you have an amazing holiday season and aren't too stressed with shopping and things like that, because it is very, very stressful. So you guys have a good week. If you like this video, like, subscribe. I post every Saturday at 6 p.m. Eastern time, and we may see a change to that next year. And I will see you all in the next video. Have a great week. Bye.